Right. Good morning, everyone. I'll be speaking in English. That's all right, since you already had a lot of French this morning. But as you can hear from my accent, I'm happy to speak in French also. If you have questions, we can have a conversation in French afterwards. So the way I've used social media in the past was like I've been involved in the negotiations, in the UN negotiation on climate change. And there I worked with different organizations using blogging and social media to try to add some weight to push governments to take some more ambitious actions on climate change. And so I guess the similarity between what I've done there and what we can discuss now a little bit is the fact that the most important in terms of climate policy is what happens at the domestic level within countries. But what we have tried to use was the moment, those 2 weeks where countries come all together in the UN to negotiate on climate change. And then we try to use these moments to push countries to do more actions, both in the UN but also at home. So we really try to use the UN to use it as a leverage and to mobilize organizations back home, to put some light on what countries are doing and what they are not doing. And I guess that's something that is quite similar, perhaps, with the way we could try to use the UPR, is that what really matters at the end of the day is not what is discussed at the UPR, but that's what your government is going to do back home. But then you have this one moment, so those 2 weeks, or particularly those 3 hours, when the government has to defend its policies, where you have suddenly a UN spotlight on the action of the government. And so I guess that's a little bit the similarity between what we try to do when we use the climate negotiations to get countries to be more ambitious within their climate policies, and what you could try to do with the UPR. I have a strong French accent, so if at any point with some language that doesn't come clear, just make some SOS signs, and I will try to repeat more carefully. So before we start, I had actually a quick question for you, because I don't really know most of you. I know that we have already some engagement on Twitter with some, but how many of you are engaged in social media work within your organization? Alright, so that's quite a lot. How many of you have communication or press officers within your organization? So someone whose task is only or really mainly to deal with these type of issues. Okay, well, so that's quite a lot. When I speak about social media today, I'm going to speak a little bit about Twitter, because it has some particular functions that makes it specifically or like particularly interesting when you use a UN forum to try to promote your issues. But we will also broaden the discussion to other social medias. My first question is, why use the UPR for social media activities? So the UPR is a process that's quite sophisticated. You have a lot of acronyms. It's like full of UN language. It's not necessarily the most understandable for the local communities or for your activists, for the press. The UPR is also taking place very far away from your constituency, so you don't have necessarily direct access to what's happening, except through webcast, for instance. And finally, the UPR is also requiring possibly you to do a lot of follow-up. So because you have such a small amount of time every 4 years that's dedicated to reviewing the policies of your country, I guess the priority of a lot of you will be to focus on what you can obtain from the UPR, try to follow up with the organization here in Geneva, see what you can obtain from them to push more pressure or to ask the right question on your country. So it's difficult perhaps to think about, when you are engaged in this kind of content-related work, to think about also the social media dimension of it. And that's the same for us when we work in the climate negotiation. I'm also an advocate looking with text, negotiating texts, and then I spend most of my day trying to look at different paragraphs and trying to propose the right language. And so social media is not always my priority, but still at the climate negotiation, as I mentioned, and the same for the UPR, there is some additional added value that are unique to this moment, to those few hours or couple of weeks. I guess here I highlight 3 added value that I've identified, and you might have some additional ones. I'd be happy to hear feedback. The first one is that certainly you have UN credibility. Whatever the UN is going to say, for instance, the media might have a lot of interest in it. because it's no longer your organization saying it, but suddenly you have also other governments asking the question. So you change the voice, it's no longer a stakeholder or NGO voice, but you have this kind of UN logo that is very interesting for the media in particular. You have a UN interest also, and when I refer to this, perhaps more when you target activists, when you try to mobilize. A lot of people are just interested in the fanciness of the UN, in hearing about what the UN is about to do, about your local problems in your communities. When we speak about climate negotiation, it's sometimes difficult to really mobilize, for instance, in France. People about the complicated decision that's happening in Paris, they take decision, or they try to take decision on climate change every month anyway. But once a year we can say, hey, the UN is looking at climate policies and France has a particular role in it. And there are some people that are more interested just because it has the UN stamp on it. And finally, one thing that's particularly important is also the fact that you have a moment. It's happening just now. There's something, so it becomes newsworthy for the media. It becomes very timely. It has a sense of urgency. So, for instance, the sessions are webcasted. So you know that the next morning for 3 hours you can watch the webcast, and it's happening just then. And very often you will see that, for instance, people will never go back to webcast of something that already happened. They will not do that during the weekend. But if you tell them this is happening just now, your government is being grilled because of the lack of human rights policies, you can really try to use that to mobilize. Does anyone see any strong added value on why we do PR? Why do special work targeted around this? We can come back to this maybe at the end when we have time for discussion. When we do communication work, I guess for all those that are communication experts, that's no news. There's 4 different things to keep in mind, and you have to keep to think about this carefully. Often we focus on the language, on what we say, and that's what we go straight at. But there are 3 elements to keep into consideration before. The first one is who is speaking, and so there, for instance, it's very different if you speak from an organizational point of view or from a personal point of view. If one of you go to the UN in Geneva for the UPR, you might use differently if you use, for instance, if you speak about Facebook or Twitter, you might say different things if you use the organizational account, where you need to maybe keep credibility a little bit, but you have more institutional power, for instance, because your organization may be already recognized within your community, or whether you speak from your own personal voice. And this is very important to differentiate both of them. So I will suggest that in most of the cases when you use both, you try to separate perhaps, or to change slightly the tone that you're using, depending on what, from which perspective you speak. The second thing that is very important to keep in mind is who is your audience. We'll come back to this afterwards, but you need to use both different languages or different themes, but also different tools depending on who do you want to reach out to. Very important is to think about what is the channel. Social media is a multitude of channels. You have different social media tools, and all of them have their strengths and their weaknesses. We'll come back to this just afterwards. And then finally, you come to content. So it's really important to just, before you start to really do any kind of communication, to take a few minutes, or even just 3 minutes, to think about those 3 other bubbles. Those are very important for the effectiveness of the message that you deliver. The content, for instance, on this picture is interesting. It can be text, it can be pictures, it can be videos, it can be a lot of different things to say exactly the same thing at the end. But choosing whether you use a picture or video will depend on those 3 different elements. Particularly in this case, for instance, the choice of format will depend on what channel are you using and what is the audience. Is that clear so far? I'm not speaking too fast and my French accent is manageable. What can you use the UPR for when you use social media? What are the communities that you can try to outreach? So here I identify 3. That's from my UNFCCC, UN Climate Negotiation experience. You might have a slightly different experience with human rights, but I guess it remains more or less the same. The first one there are journalists, or the media at large. When I say the media, it's not necessarily purely journalists or media channels, but it might be also a very prominent social media activist. For instance, for me personally, I have 5,000 people following me on Twitter, And so sometimes now I have people sending me, NGOs telling me, can you please repeat this? Because even if I'm not a journalist, they will know that on climate policy in France, I'm one of the voices that sometimes people listen. So it's important to keep in mind that the media is more than just the classical journalists. Bloggers particularly are also very important sources. The second community are the activists, or the communities in general, the ones you work with, and also the potential allies. And then the third one, sorry for the White House, but it's the decision makers or your governmental officials. It can be both politicians, but also like that civil servant working on the issues. Let's look at them one by one. First, the activists. When you target the activists or the communities, here I combine both of them, it's important to think about different dimensions of your communication. The first one is storytelling. When you speak to an individual person, someone that is, like, let's say, a member of your, or volunteer within your organization, for those organizations that are grassroots oriented, or someone in the local community where you are acting, it's very important to think about narratives, to tell the story in a way that really engage them, where they can identify what is the relevance of the thing that you're trying to explain to their personal life, or to the life of people in their communities. When we speak about storytelling, I mean, this is worth a full presentation or a full training just on that, and I'm not an expert on this, so I won't get in depth. But for instance, things that are very important is telling first-person stories, or telling individual stories, reflecting always people and not processes. So when you speak about the UPR, the UN, I'm sure you can find hundreds of different acronyms that you could use, HRC for Human Rights Council and so on. All of those are to be forgotten about, and then just make the language as clear and as simple as possible, but also reflect why what is happening in some offices in Geneva or in some conference room is actually important for the local farmer, for a local indigenous community, or even trade unions in your country.